Excuse me. Can anyone hear me? Sorry for the technical difficulties. Jackie, I can't hear you at the moment. You might be muted. I guess it's just me, folks. Can't hear you.
Let's see, Kaylee. Whoa. Device now rather than my usual work computer. Okay, I switched to a different computer. I guess it's just like 2020 rearing its ugly head yet here in 2021. So to start,
babe.
This article was all about ice fishing in Wisconsin and focused specifically on whitefish. So what is it about whitefish that make them particularly good for ice fishing?
I think, honestly, probably the most important characteristic about them is that they just taste really darn good, and that's the major reason why people want to catch them, because they taste good. But also, they are like several species of fish. They're active under the ice during the winter, and so they will be actively looking for food, and thus there's something you can catch.
Okay, that makes sense. All right. So when so does ice fishing generally have a positive, a negative, or a neutral impact on fish populations, and how and why?
That's a great question, and I wish there were a simple answer to it. It's just like asking someone, when you leave for the day to go fishing, hey, what are we going to catch today and how many? You just don't know. Um, and so, in some years, it can actually be the case that for some species of fish, you will actually catch more during ice fishing season than you will during the open water or spring to fall fishing season, which kind of surprised me to find that out. But some winters it will be the opposite, where you will catch much fewer fish under the ice than you would during the open water season. So honestly, it really depends year to year, and in some years, again, depending on the fish, the winter catch can represent more than 50% of the total year-round harvest of that fish. Other years, it can be much, much smaller.
So when we're talking about like these different fish populations and trying to figure out how humans might be impacting them, how do scientists assess if activities like ice fishing or others are negatively impacting a population? And also, how long does it take before that change becomes apparent?
That's a great question. Um, a lot of times, this is done through just basic population surveys. So, scientists like those with the Wisconsin DNR will go out regularly as part of their jobs, as part of their what they call their annual surveys, and go out and just set a net or use electrofishing or a variety of methods depending on whether they're sampling in a river and a small river versus a big river or a small lake versus a big lake. But they try to assess what species of fish are there and what the relative abundances might be. So by doing this on a regular basis, they can get a feel for sort of the baseline or usual population of fish within that fish community, so that when they see drastic changes from one sample to the next, they can go and look at previous surveys and say, well, was this thing sort of slowly declining over time, and it just kind of became apparent now? Or is this a real sudden decline, or the opposite? Was it a real sudden or slow increase in the population as well? In terms of then assigning a cause to that, well, sometimes it can be very obvious. Like, for example, if there is a really, really cold winter or a really, really hot, dry summer. A lot of times, then you will see there during the next year or during the next season, you can see a change in the fish population, depending on whether the event was beneficial or harmful to the population. Sometimes it can be a lot trickier to figure that out. And of course, it might be the case where it's not just one simple cause, where it's a combination of a variety of things.
Mhm. Just a quick follow-up question that piqued my interest while you were talking. So you mentioned in passing that these scientists have different ways of testing or gathering data, depending if it's like a small river or a big river or a lake or whatever it might be. Why are the testing methods different depending on the size or type of body of water?
That's another really great question. And the simple answer to that is that different bodies of water uh, uh, have different habitats in them for fish. And so you need to use different sampling gear in order to best sample the fish from those habitats. So, for example, in a small lake, you can sample that pretty easily, usually with what's called a seine net, and that's actually a lot of fun to do. That's where a couple or three folks go out and they literally just drag a big net through the water. They can put on their swimsuits and just drag a big net through the water, and they see what they get. That can be a lot of fun. But in a big deep lake, you generally have to use a boat, and you have to set what are called gill nets, and you can set those at different depths And usually what you would do is you would set those even like overnight. So you go out one day, set it, and this is how they would do that in Lake Michigan, for example. So they'd set the net, go back to shore, come back the next day, and then pull up the net to see what fish are in it. Rivers provide a different challenge, oftentimes because rivers are fast flowing and they're really rocky habitats. So a lot of times nets don't work very well. So actually, scientists will use electrofishing. They will use electricity to stun the fish to bring them up to the surface to see what are there.
And that doesn't harm the fish, I'm assuming.
If you are not careful,
Okay.
it actually can. Just to be perfectly honest about it. But if you know what you're doing, like scientists at the DNR, and I use electrofishing methods as well. If you know what you're doing, you can minimize the harm. You can minimize the risk, and ensure that the fish are returned safely to the habitat.
Okay. Okay. I can just tell you, like, as a layperson, the idea of introducing like electricity into water sounds a little dicey, but
No, it is a dicey proposition, and there's a reason why you can't go to the sporting goods store and buy an electrofishing rig because it is dangerous to do, and we receive specialized training in order to do that. So you are right to kind of raise a caution flag when you hear about mixing electricity and water, because it's just as dangerous out in the wild as it is in your own home.
yeah. Okay. Wow. That is actually really interesting. So, kind of going along with how scientists understand what's happening with fish population, the article mentions groups of whitefish being separated by year into classes. So, can you explain what that means and how scientists use that idea of classes to understand fish better?
So a year class are just all the fish born of a particular species in a particular year. So you can even think of that as like your graduating class. We all talk about, oh, I'm a member of the class of, whatever. And a lot of those folks, right, from your graduating class, probably a lot of them, if you did all of your elementary and middle and high school in the same city, you probably entered kindergarten with those folks and worked your way up to graduation. And so think of that as kind of like a year class. All the fish born this year in 2021 would be the 2021 class.
Mhm.
And so this year they would be called year zero fish. And then in 2022, they would be year one, year two, year three, and on like that. And the reason why we do that is that's a way to track how the population grows or decreases. It's a way to track survival. It's a way to track reproduction. And answers a lot of those questions that you were asking earlier, or helps us answer, I should say, a lot of those questions you were asking earlier about, like, well, how do you know if this event is going to negatively or positively influence a fish population? Well, in part, we do that by tracking the various year classes present in a population. We're getting
All
some
right.
questions from the folks at home.
All right. So, I don't see any from the public yet, but we do have some folks watching. So
Good.
another question is it normal for animal populations to just wax and wane over time naturally on their own? And is it possible for scientists to distinguish between normal population cycles and ones that are impacted by human activity?
Yeah, so in the wild, in perfectly untouched areas, even in those circumstances, yes, it is absolutely natural for animal populations to wax and wane, to increase and decrease. And in general, that can be due to some of the things that we've already talked about. So, like if it's a real cold winter, a real dry summer, something like that. And even if events like that wouldn't affect the species that you're interested in studying, maybe that would influence the food organisms that the species you study eat. So, for example, even though it's it's real cold and snowy in winter, and we don't necessarily like that, but if we think ahead, that's a cold, snowy winter is really important if you like your springtime birds, for example, because the insects that those birds eat are often hibernating, or their larvae are hibernating under the snow. And they need a nice thick snow cover actually to stay warm. As strange as that sounds, snow can be a great insulator. So we need these cold winters with thick snows if you want to have all those pretty songbirds in the spring. So, I bring that up just because that's an example of where, a bird that's currently down in Florida or South America or Central America really could care less if it's snowing and cold here in Wisconsin right now. But when they migrate back, they want to have a nice supply of insects that they can feed their young once they start mating. So we have to also think about things like that. And so, getting back to your question, now, like, well, how can we tell? Well, again, unfortunately, sometimes we can only figure this out after something bad happens. Sometimes we can, we all know that pollution is bad, or a dry summer can be bad, but we're not going to know the effects of that until later, until maybe even the next year or next several years, as we watch that population, as we watch whether or not the year class born in that year makes up a significant part of the subsequent years, or if it just disappears altogether, as has happened with the perch population sometimes in Lake Michigan. There have been some severe crashes of the yellow perch population in Lake Michigan that we've only been able to, again, we notice that the population just decreases, and then we have to kind of look back in time, again, looking at previous population records, looking at previous densities of their food organisms and things like that, to try to piece together what the heck might have happened.
So is it possible to distinguish between an impact on the population that is caused by people and one that just happens on its own naturally?
Sometimes it is, especially if, for example, we have a very distinct sort of, for lack of a better term, point source sort of problem. Like, for example, if we know that there was a big chemical spill or something like that, then it's very easy to point to that and say, okay, this chemical spill happened in this year, and then we noticed that in subsequent years, right, that we lost fish from the population. But in cases where it's not like that, where we just notice sort of a real subtle decline in the population over several years, that can be very, very tough to disentangle. It's possible, again, especially if we can point to, say, accumulating pollutants in the environment. So some sorts of pollution, right, just build up over time. We don't have that big one singular oil spill or whatever it might have been. So that's why monitoring for pollution can also be important, because as we see pollutants increase over time, and then if we see a concomitant decrease in the fish population, that can help. But that takes a lot of work, and oftentimes it's not just a very easy snap answer.
Yeah. And I would expect as well that sort of tracking both increases in pollution and then the subsequent decreases in the fish population, that in order to like get a big data set that makes a compelling case about what's going on, I assume that can take like how many years would you say that can take to develop that data set?
Oh, years and years and years. I mentioned this decrease in the perch population in Lake Michigan that happened, in the mid to late 90s and early 2000s. People are still trying to figure that out. And they've come up with a lot of different answers, ranging from a change in the size of the mesh of nets that were used. And in this case, what they were thinking is that they switched to a bigger mesh net that caught female perch. Male perch, because they're kind of skinnier, could just swim right through. And so, because of that, they removed all the females from the population, so there were no eggs. But then there were all kinds of other things, like there was an invasive species, the spiny water flea, which was exactly what it sounds like. It's a real small little crustacean, like a crab or a shrimp, that's just covered in these little spines. And so when the perch that were born at that time hatched out, instead of the yummy little mayflies and things like that, and Daphnia, which are the normal prey species for perch, there are instead just all these nasty water fleas that the little perch ate, but then they couldn't digest them because of all these long spines on them. And then people also pointed to various types of pollution. And again, people are still to this day kind of arguing about what happened. And I think most people are kind of concluding that it was just this perfect storm of events. So it can actually be very difficult, in some cases, to figure that out. Again, without a singular sort of point source event.
So one thing that struck me from your comments here is that in our previous interview back in September with Dr. JJ Weiss, another MPM adjunct curator, one thing he also talked about with what he studies is the length of these experiments. So is that like kind of the norm in the natural sciences, that it can take many years? Are there any things you can study in the natural sciences that you can do an experiment or collect data and like very quickly arrive at a conclusion?
I'm sorry, you kind of froze up there, so I didn't hear the end of the question. You said, is there anything you can study in the natural sciences? And I assume that you said, well, you should tell me what you said.
Where you can sort of collect a data set and like very quickly arrive at a conclusion? Or is it the case that for the most part, it does need to be these really long, like overarching, like many, many years in a row of collecting data?
That's a great question, and I don't want to dodge your question, but um, the answer is it depends,
Okay.
and it depends on the question that the scientist is asking. And again, sometimes if you're well, it depends. I don't know if you would be lucky to have an easy answer or not, because part of the fun of science is doing these long kind of detective story sorts of things, where you sometimes end up, wandering down a blind alley and you hit a dead end and you have to turn around and check something else out. So again, I'm not trying to dodge your question, because it is a really important one. But it really depends, and it depends on the question, and it depends on the situation that you're investigating as well. In the case of that perch example, I said, you could break that apart into little sub questions, right? And where you could at least try to rule something out. And this is why we do experiments. And I talk about this with my students. It sounds weird, but when we do an experiment to test a hypothesis, we're actually setting our question up to fail. As I explained to my students, hypotheses have to be falsifiable. In other words, you have to ask a question to which the answer can be no. If you're asking a question to which the only answer is yes, well, then that's not an interesting question. So sometimes the point to this is that sometimes in science, you do all this work and you find out, well, no, that's not the answer, and it really is just, okay, well, back to the drawing board, and we try to figure that out. So it depends. Sometimes you're really lucky, and yes, the answer to that first question you ask is yes, indubitably, this is what caused the population decline. But sometimes it really is years and years of detective work, which is kind of the fun of science.
Yeah, interesting. So in one of your responses, you were talking a little bit about, like, in an example about the impact of invasive species. So the topic of this article was specifically whitefish. So how do whitefish compete against invasive species?
That is also a really fascinating question. And so I should start to answer it a little bit by talking about the biology of whitefish. And whitefish are relatives of salmon. Even though they don't look a lot like a trout or a salmon, they're a relative of the salmon. And the whitefish are part of a subfamily of salmon called the Coregonines. So the family Coregoninae. And at one point in Lake Michigan, I think there were 10 or 12 species of Coregonines present. And the cool thing about it is that all of these Coregonines had evolved within the Great Lakes Basin. And if you remember your geology, the Great Lakes aren't all that old. They're just 10 to 15,000 years old. So these like 12 species of fish evolved very, very quickly in less than, 10 or 15,000 years, which is extraordinarily fast. And the way that they kind of diverged from each other was by kind of occupying different habitats and eating slightly different food, and actually even timing when they reproduce differently. So some would spawn in the fall, like whitefish does. Some of them actually spawned under the ice. So what does this have to do with invasive species? I'm getting there. So what happened is this, is, as you know, and as probably a lot of you folks know, Lake Michigan is just filled with invasive species. And Lake Michigan was hit with this sort of three-headed monster of invasive fish in the early to mid 1900s. You had smelt come in, which are not native. That's native to the Atlantic coast. You had alewife come in, and alewife are not native to the Great Lakes. They came in from the Atlantic coast. And then you had sea lamprey come in. And just as the name implies, sea lamprey do not live in freshwater lakes. They live in the sea. But they spawn in fresh water, which is how they found their way into the Great Lakes. So this triple attack came in, and sea lamprey attacked big coregonines and big fish by, eating them, basically. But smelt and alewife started competing with the coregonines by eating the same food as they do. And that caused several of those species of coregonines to go extinct, such that now we only recognize 6 species of 8, I think, because we have to count lake whitefish and round whitefish a little separately. So I think there are 8 left. And so, kind of turning your question around, well, how did lake whitefish survive? Well, one thing that allowed them to survive is the way that they eat food. And I sent along a picture of their gill rakers. Something I think I called it lake white. There that is. This is great. So I'm sure everyone has heard of gills, right? And fish with their gills. But those gills, those respiratory organs, are anchored onto a bony arch. And that bony arch has these funny little teeth kind of coming off of them called gill rakers. And those gill rakers are what fish use to actually trap food. So when fish take in a bite of food or a mouthful of food, it gets sorted out, it gets strained out by those gill rakers. And as funny as it sounds, fish have very specific sizes and shapes of gill rakers. And so the Coregonines who had gill rakers whose sizes and shapes were most similar to fish like alewife and smelt, well, they didn't fare as well because those guys were competing for the same food. But lake whitefish ate food that was a different size and a different shape. Lake whitefish actually tend to eat stuff from the bottom of the lake, little invertebrates that live in the rocks at the bottom of the lake, whereas smelt and alewife eat the little invertebrates that are swimming around in the water. So by living in a different habitat, and by eating different food, that kind of allowed lake whitefish to survive, and what still allows it to survive in the face of even more invasive species in the lake.
So I just want to pick up on something you had said previously to make sure I'm understanding it correctly, because, I'm myself more of like a layperson to the natural science.
And I probably explained it very poorly, I'm sure.
So what you're saying is that there were several different kind of related species that all evolved in the Great Lakes. And that's just sort of interesting to me, because if they're all being shaped by the same environment, how did they evolve into like separate, distinct species with these different characteristics?
Oh, I love that question. That's a question that that is kind of near and dear to my heart because I study that very question in African fishes in one of the African Great Lakes in Lake Malawi. Um, so think of a lake. We often think, okay, it's a lake, it's a hole with water in it. What could possibly be different? Um, well, actually, lakes are fantastic habitats. And even though, yeah, if we want to be reductive, yes, it is a hole with water in it, but there's all kinds of different habitats within the lake. We can vary the habitat by depth. There's shallow water and deep water. And for aquatic organisms, living in shallow water is very different from living in deep water. Also, we can talk about sort of the lake bottom versus the open water. And we see this, there's lots of fish that specialize on swimming around in or living off of the bottom, right? And so in order to do that really well, you have to be really good at maneuvering, right? You have to move around and slither around and swim around rocks or logs or whatever substrate is down there. So that often involves you have to have a different body shape. You have to have a different mouth for eating the food there, as opposed to if you're a fish living in the open water, where there's no obstacles. You can just swim and swim and swim and swim. So your body is going to be built a little differently. It's not going to be built for kind of sneaking or slithering or hiding in one spot. You're going to be built for speed, which is why fish that live in the open water tend to look like little torpedoes, whereas fish that live on the bottom tend to either look like eels, they'll be long and slithery to allow them to kind of slither through rocks, or they'll be kind of deep-bodied and even kind of chubby looking, like a bluegill, for example. So living in those different habitats requires different adaptations. eating different food requires different adaptations. And as those fish evolve to meet the needs of those different habitats to try to eat this different food, a lot of times they just become distinct from one another. And those distinctions continue to build and build and build, such that, when those fish kind of come back and kind of interact, they actually don't even, we use the term recognize each other as being the same species anymore.
Wow, that's really interesting.
It is cool. And the term for that is often called we call that adaptive radiation. Or in the case of either the African Great Lakes fish that I study, or even the Corrigonines, we call that a species flock, a flock of species that have evolved from a single common ancestor and have evolved into a numerous different forms.
All right. So, what is happening in the life cycle of a whitefish during the winter season? So, can a particularly warm or cold winter impact the whitefish population, and how?
Yeah, so actually, wintertime is a really crucial time for whitefish. I mentioned a little while ago that whitefish spawn in the fall, and they'll spawn depending on the particular weather that year. They'll spawn anywhere from late October to mid December, and sometimes they'll do it multiple times within that time period. So. By the time the ice comes in, at least, and when Lake Michigan ice is over, um, the whitefish have spawned, and the adults kind of go off and do their thing. They wait to get caught by an ice fisherman, but the eggs are hanging out there, and so they remain as eggs throughout the winter. And temperature is really important for this because at this point, then we have to think of Lake Michigan as being an incubator for whitefish eggs during the winter. Now, normally when we think of an incubator, we think it's a nice warm place, for keeping our chick eggs warm or whatever. But in this case, we need an incubator that's set to just above freezing. And so those eggs have to be at about just above 0 degrees centigrade, 35 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's really important for those eggs to remain cool in order for the fish to develop normally. Because these guys are going to be in their eggs for about 4.5 months. They'll start hatching out in late March and early April. And both the egg period and the larval period is a very sensitive time for these fish. And so probably the most important thing that's going on during the winter months in terms of the life cycle of the lake whitefish is that those eggs are incubating and just waiting for springtime. They're waiting for the ice to open up so that the young can hatch.
Yeah. Are there any, I'm just thinking about some things, about other species of animals. Are there any predators that particularly target the whitefish when they're in that incubation period?
There are lots and lots and lots of critters that eat fish eggs, and eggs in general are just a great food because they're filled with all kinds of important nutrients. The eggs are filled with fats and proteins and nucleic acids, these big molecules that are full of energy, like in the case of fats, but are also very expensive to manufacture inside of the body. So eggs are great, kind of cheap and plentiful sources of calories and of nutrition. So lots of critters will eat eggs. So whitefish, like a lot of fish, produce lots and lots and lots of eggs. A big female can produce thousands of eggs. Uh, and so they spawn in kind of shallow water, and the female just lays the eggs in the rocks and rubble at the bottom of the lake, and not too deep of a water, maybe about 7 to 30 feet deep or so. And the male fertilizes them, and then the adults just swim off. But sometimes even, and this is pretty common in fish, as horrific as it sounds, sometimes what will happen is the female will lay the eggs, the male will fertilize them, and then they just go back and eat them. That's just what happens. Or if another pair of whitefish comes in, or trio, a lot of times it'll be a female and two males. They'll come in and spawn and then eat the eggs that were already there. But there are all kinds of smaller fish and invertebrates. So things like crayfish, for example. I think most folks know what crayfish are. They'll go and eat those eggs. Other small bottom-dwelling fish, like sculpin, for example, will go and eat those. And again, it's just a cheap and plentiful resource.
So fish are, a type of animal similar to like butterflies, where their species strategy for survival is to just lay like thousands of eggs with the idea that like at least some of them will make it onto adulthood and then to create the next generation. Are scientists able to assess even roughly like what percentage of eggs laid make it all the way to adulthood?
Yeah, and as you might suspect, it ain't many. It's with a lot of species of fish, especially those that produce so many eggs. Um, the percentage surviving to adulthood is 2%.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
yeah, yeah. Well, when you're laying, as thousands of eggs, if all of those thousands of fish made it, well, I mean, on the one hand, that sounds good, right? Because everyone's surviving, but there's only so much food in the habitat. There's only so much habitat in the habitat. It is natural and normal for a lot of these things to not survive to adulthood.
It's also really interesting thinking about these like very sort of delicate, fragile food webs in a habitat like a lake. And so I suppose, if every one of those eggs made it all the way to adulthood, as you were saying, that's a really rich food source that is suddenly no longer available to other critters in the
Right.
lake as well. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Let's see. So the article mentioned that improved water quality protections have helped the whitefish make a comeback. So what are some protections that animal populations need, and do we have those in place in Wisconsin already?
Um, yes, we could certainly use more of them, but there are some really important protections that have been developed. And when thinking about Wisconsin lakes and rivers in general, probably one of the most important ones was controls for phosphorus. And probably some of you have never heard of phosphorus before, really care about it. But what you can do is this: next time you're washing your dishes or you're washing your laundry, pick up your dish detergent or your laundry detergent and look on the ingredient label. And somewhere on that label, it will say phosphorus free. This is a phosphorus free soap. And that was really important. And this started actually when I was a kid. And I can remember being a youngster and seeing things on the news about phosphorus and things like that. And so phosphorus is, we like to use it in our soap because it rinses, especially our dishes, really well. We all hate water spots on our fancy glasses, right? But when we add phosphorus to our detergent, that phosphorus helps to rinse the water off really well. So we used it a lot in soap, but the problem is this: phosphorus is an extraordinarily important nutrient in freshwater systems. Um, it is the nutrient that is in the least supply in fresh water. So our primary producers, so things like algae and plants, really, really love phosphorus. And so this kind of came to the head when I was a kid, in the 70s and the big ecology era and things like that, because people started to say, well, okay, phosphorus is a problem. And then like the soap industry, big soap, was fighting back, and they would say, no, 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 you have no data. Phosphorus isn't important. What are you talking about? So finally, it was a scientist at UW-Madison who did this really neat, very simple, and super obvious experiment. It's one of these wonderful experiments where you don't need to do any statistical analysis. You just have to show a picture. And I sent a picture just today. It was the phosphorus lake. There it is. So this is a picture of an experiment. This was done in the experimental lakes area, which is supported by the National Science Foundation and things like that. And this guy came up with this wonderful experiment where he said, okay, here's my experiment. I'm going to divide a lake in half. Which sounds strange, but he could do it with what's called a limno curtain, a sort of impermeable plastic barrier. That I'm gonna divide this lake in half, and in one half of the lake I'm going to add a bunch of phosphorus, and in the other half I'm not. And what you see in this picture is the top half of the lake has no phosphorus added to it. But that bottom, so you can see that yellow line kind of in the middle of the picture, that's the limno curtain. Limno means lake and curtain means curtain. So it's literally like a plastic curtain, a shower curtain right through the middle of the lake. And so on the bottom half, he added phosphorus. And you can just see the difference. The reason why that bottom half of the lake looks green is all of those primary producers, all of that algae just went nuts. It got all of this phosphorus and started to grow and just reproduce like mad. Now, the danger to that, now, of course, we look at that, and you can drive around in Wisconsin in the summer, and you see all those farm ponds or those little ponds that are just green or just filled with algae and scum, and we just say, oh, that's just a scummy little lake. But what's going on in there is actually something really important. And so that when the algae goes out of control like that, it ends up actually using up, taking out all of the oxygen from the water, so that there's no oxygen in there for fish or any other animals for that matter. What does this mean? Why am I talking about phosphorus? Well, obviously, phosphorus is really important to control. And so, I remember seeing this picture showing up on like 60 Minutes in the evening news because, again, it's so simple. And so this was the way that science could fight back against big soap. And so finally, as a result of this picture, they had to remove phosphorus from laundry detergent and things like that, specifically because we want to avoid situations like this. And this was actually going on in the Great Lakes in the 70s. We all heard about in the 70s, and some of you might have heard that Lake Erie, right? Big Lake Erie died in the 1970s. In part because especially the shallow areas became so choked with phosphorus that they had these big algae blooms, which led to fish die-offs. And so by controlling phosphorus, we can then prevent something like this from happening. So I chose that example just because it is such a dramatic example. But there have been similar controls put on other things that we that end up in our wastewater. And some of these are things like these legacy chemicals, like the PFOAs, the perfluorinated something or others. These are the things that are used to line nonstick pans, or used to be used to line nonstick pans, for example, that can persist in people's bloodstreams. So not only does it help to protect fish in the lakes, but it also ends up protecting us as well.
So one question, I think this will probably be our last one for today, but I
Sure.
just want to pick up on something you said. What do scientists mean when they say a dead lake? Like it's just so incredibly inhospitable that nothing can live there anymore?
Essentially, yeah. I mean, and as we all learned from Jurassic Park, life finds a way. So usually, what we mean by a dead lake is that the big charismatic animals tend to die off. So in a dead lake, there are still things living there, and some things love dead lakes, like algae, and really tough critters, like some amphibian larvae can actually do very well in those highly eutrophic. That's the fancy term, eutrophic, meaning that there's a lot of algae going on in there and not a lot of oxygen. Um, so basically, what it means is that a dead lake, the oxygen levels have plummeted so far that it can't support big vertebrate animals, so it can't support fish. And because there are no fish in there, a lot of times the predatory animals, so things like turtles and mammals and even birds, will kind of abandon it. And it's just some of these really tough critters that can persist in low oxygen environments. They'll stick around, but not much else.
Oh, interesting. Are any of our Great Lakes in any sort of immediate on the horizon danger of becoming a dead lake?
Not not recently. I mean, they face lots and lots of other challenges, but again, thanks to some of the pollution controls that have been put in place. I mean, even Lake Erie has recovered significantly. There are still some highly polluted, highly impacted areas, but from the days in the 70s, when Lake Erie was called dead, and there were lots of other problems around that Ohio shore, especially. Um, um, that has helped significantly. So I don't think that we're in great danger of eutrophication in the Great Lakes. But again, that's not to say that there aren't other very drastic problems facing those lakes.
Talking about Lake Erie, and you mentioned the Ohio shore, and then the 1970s, it clicked in my brain. Is what happened in Lake Erie tied to the name is escaping me now, but the river in Ohio that actually caught on fire because it was so polluted?
Um, I don't think so. I think with that pollution, I think that was just a lot of where the yeah, I want to say Cuyahoga, but I can't. I don't think that's correct.
Okay.
Um, but that yes, that river did catch fire, and that had to do not with phosphorus, but with just industrial pollution.
Yeah.
We have an unfortunate legacy in this country of using our rivers as open sewers, as convenient waste disposal units, unfortunately. And that included a lot of deadly chemicals, a lot of flammable chemicals, and I believe that is what happened there.
Okay. Wow. Well, I feel like we had a really interesting, rich conversation today where we were able to talk about the article, but also get into some other questions about science and process and how it relates to us here in the Great Lakes. So thank you to Mike for a really interesting conversation that illuminated a lot of the science behind activities right here in our state. And thank you to all of you out there for tuning in. And we apologize for the little bit of technical difficulties at the beginning, just trying to run our programs from our homes. But be sure to visit NPN's Community of Curiosity online for more great events and activities like this one. And we'll drop a link to that in the comments. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you all soon.
Thank you.